September 14, 1945. A detention facility near Nottingham, England. The knock came at dawn. Not the brutal hammering they'd been trained to expect, but a firm, measured rapping, 3 strikes against the wooden barracks door. Inside, 23 women froze. Some dropped the torn blankets they'd been clutching. Others reached instinctively for each other's hands. The youngest, a girl named Greta, who'd turned 19 somewhere over the Atlantic, pressed herself against the far wall and began to whisper the only prayer she could remember from childhood. They knew what men did to captured women. They'd been told since they were children in the Bund Deutsche Myrtle, told in whispers, in warning stories, in the careful way their mothers fell silent when certain topics arose. And they'd seen it, too. In the frantic final days, women pulled from cellars in Berlin. Nurses dragged screaming from field hospitals as the fronts collapsed. The propaganda had promised them that the British were no better. Worse, perhaps, because they hid their cruelty behind politeness. Aunt Clyden, Liesl murmured, her voice cracking, "They'll make us strip for inspection. For we won't," someone else hissed. "We won't take our clothes off." The door swung open. If you've never heard this story, you're not alone. This chapter of history was buried for decades. Hit subscribe so you never miss the untold stories that textbooks left out. 3 British guards stood in the doorframe, silhouetted against the pale morning light. They wore standard khaki uniforms, clean and pressed. The women could smell soap and tobacco. One of the guards, a middle-aged man with thinning hair and wire-rimmed glasses, held a clipboard. Another carried something wrapped in brown paper. The third, barely older than the prisoners themselves, kept his eyes fixed somewhere above their heads, as though he couldn't bear to look directly at them. "Good morning," the man with the clipboard said in careful accented German. "We've brought breakfast." Silence. The women stared. Breakfast. Not orders to undress. Not line up for processing. Not the leering inspection they'd steel themselves against. Just breakfast. The guard with the brown paper package stepped forward slowly, telegraphing every movement. He set it on the rough wooden table in the center of the room. When he unfolded the wrapping, the smell hit them first. Bread. Real bread, still warm, with a golden crust that had somehow survived the rationing that gripped all of Britain. Beside it, he placed a tin of margarine, a jar of marmalade, and impossibly a glass bottle of fresh milk. "We'll be back in an hour with hot water for washing," the older guard said. He glanced at his clipboard, then back at the women. "You'll need to register your names and units for the records, but there's no rush. Eat first." They left. The door clicked shut, unlocked. The women realized they could have opened it from the inside at any moment. For a long time, no one moved. Then Greta began to cry and the spell broke. These women had not expected to become prisoners of war. Most had never expected to leave Germany at all. They were not soldiers, not in the traditional sense. They were Narsen communications auxiliaries, radio operators, telephonists, and cipher clerks who'd been recruited from the Women's Labor Service and scattered across occupied Europe as the Wehrmacht's vast administrative apparatus swelled beyond what men alone could staff. There were nurses, too, and secretaries attached to Luftwaffe field hospitals. They wore gray-blue uniforms with the eagle and swastika insignia. They'd been taught to march, to salute, to file reports in triplicate. They'd been told they were essential to the war effort, the invisible backbone that kept armies fed, supplied, and connected across thousands of miles. And when the Reich collapsed in the spring of 1945, they'd been told nothing at all. Liesl Hartmann, 24, had worked the radio desk at a signal station in Schleswig-Holstein. She'd spent her days transcribing weather reports and supply requisitions in a cramped room that smelled of machine oil and stale coffee. When British troops rolled through on May 6, 2 days before the official surrender, she and 14 other women had simply stood up from their desks, hands raised, and waited. No firefight, no dramatic last stand, just the quiet surrender of people who understood the war was over. Margaret Fisher, 31, had been a surgical nurse in a field hospital outside Hamburg. She'd amputated gangrenous limbs by candlelight, held boys' hands while they died of sepsis, and learned to sleep through the sound of shells. When the fighting stopped, she'd walked out into the hospital courtyard, still wearing her blood-spattered apron, and asked the first British medical officer she saw if she could keep working. He'd said no. Greta Schultz, 19, had worked in a communications bunker beneath Berlin for 3 months before the city fell. She typed orders she didn't understand and forwarded messages about divisions that no longer existed. On April 30th, when someone whispered that the Führer was dead, she'd felt nothing, just a vast echoing numbness. The Russians came 5 days later. She'd fled west with a column of refugees, walked 200 m in boots that disintegrated around her feet, and finally collapsed at a British checkpoint near Lübeck. They'd given her water. She'd told them everything. By August, nearly 3,000 German women from various auxiliary units had been rounded up across the British occupation zone. Most would be repatriated within months, sent back to a shattered Germany to fend for themselves. But a few hundred, those who'd worked in sensitive communications roles, who might possess intelligence value or who'd been captured in territories that required further processing, were shipped west to Britain. The crossing had been a nightmare painted in shades of gray. They'd boarded a transport ship at Cu Haven on a morning thick with fog. No one told them where they were going. Rumors swirled. America, Canada, England, Scotland, or perhaps just the bottom of the North Sea, a convenient solution to the problem of what to do with women who'd served the enemy. They were herded below deck into a cargo hold that still smelled of the ammunition crates it had carried on the voyage east. 200 women packed into a space meant for freight. The air grew thick and hot. Someone vomited, then someone else. Soon the smell was unbearable. I thought we'd drown, Liesl would write years later. Or suffocate. Either way, I couldn't imagine arriving anywhere alive. But they didn't drown. After 36 hours of rolling seas and rising panic, the engines changed pitch. The ship slowed through the gaps in the deck above. They heard gulls, the first birds they'd heard in days. Then voices in English, sharp and efficient, calling out numbers and coordinates. The ship bumped against a dock. A hatch opened. Light poured in. Everyone up. Single file. They climbed a narrow ladder into the shocking brightness of an English afternoon. The port, they'd learned later it was Harwich, stretched before them. Cranes, warehouses, men in uniform moving with the purposeful chaos of any military logistics hub. But it was the abundance that struck them silent. Trucks lined up bumper to bumper, their beds piled with crates of supplies, mountains of coal, stacks of timber. And beyond the port, through the gaps between buildings, they glimpsed green fields, actual green, not the cratered, shell-blasted gray they'd grown accustomed to. Germany was starving. Here, even the gulls looked fat. They were loaded onto trains, actual passenger coaches, not cattle cars, and given sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. White bread, ham, a sliver of cheese. Greta ate hers in 3 bites and cried into her hands. The train carried them north through a landscape that seemed almost offensively intact. Villages with roofs, churches with spires, children playing in fields, no rubble, no craters, no burned-out husks of buildings. Margaret pressed her face to the window and felt something crack inside her chest. Not quite anger, not quite grief, but some mixture of both. They didn't suffer, she whispered. Not like we did. But that wasn't quite true, as they'd learn. Britain had suffered its own way. The Blitz, the U-boat blockades, the rationing that would stretch on for years after the war. The difference was that Britain had survived with its infrastructure largely intact. Germany had been ground to dust. They arrived at the detention facility near Nottingham as the sun set. A converted estate, they learned, some wealthy family's country house that had been requisitioned for the war effort and never given back. It had barbed wire now and guard towers and rows of hastily constructed wooden barracks. But it also had running water, electricity, and a kitchen that produced actual meals at regular intervals. That first night, they huddled together in silence, waiting for the other shoe to drop. The breakfast moments stayed with them. Even years later, when they'd returned to Germany and rebuilt their lives, they'd remember the smell of warm bread and the quiet voice of the British guard who'd said, "Eat first." This is where everything they'd been taught began to unravel. And the real story begins. Stay with us and don't forget to hit the like button if you're learning something new. Because it wasn't just the breakfast, it was what came after. That first afternoon, a woman in a Red Cross uniform arrived, British, middle-aged, with tired eyes and a gentle manner. Through a translator, she explained that they'd each receive a medical examination, voluntary. She emphasized they could refuse, but it was recommended, given the conditions they'd endured during transport. The women exchanged glances, a medical examination. They knew what that meant or thought they did. The euphemisms for violation were well rehearsed. "I'll go first," Margaret said quietly. She was the oldest, the one who'd seen the most. If it was going to be bad, better she face it and warn the others. The examination room was clean, almost clinical. A female doctor, also British, also middle-aged, gestured for Margaret to sit. There was no examination table, just a chair. The doctor checked her pulse, listened to her lungs, looked in her throat. She noted some malnutrition, mild dehydration, the early signs of a respiratory infection. She prescribed rest, extra rations, and penicillin, that miracle drug they'd only heard whispers about. "That's all?" Margaret asked through the translator. "That's all," the doctor confirmed. "Unless there's something else you'd like to discuss." Margaret walked back to the barracks in a daze. "She just examined me," she told the others. "Like a doctor. That's all." Over the following days, the pattern held. Meals arrived 3 times daily. Simple but adequate. Porridge and tea for breakfast, soup and bread for lunch, some kind of meat stew for dinner with root vegetables, and occasionally pudding. No one made them work beyond basic cleaning duties in their own quarters. No one shouted. No one struck them. The guards maintained professional distance, but weren't cruel. They'd even installed a radio in the common room, though they were careful about what broadcasts they allowed. Greta found herself crying at strange moments, over a cup of hot tea, over the feel of a clean blanket, over the simple fact that she'd been allowed to sleep through the night without interruption. "I don't understand," she said to Liesel one evening. "Why are they being kind?" Liesel, who'd spent the war transcribing orders and learning to read between the lines, had a theory. "Maybe because they can afford to be," she said slowly. "They won. They don't need to prove anything." But that didn't fully explain it, because kindness they were learning took many forms. There was the day Liesel received a package not from home. Mail from Germany was still barely functioning, but from the camp administration. Inside a thick wool cardigan, gently worn but clean, and a note in careful English that the translator read aloud from the women's voluntary service. "Stay warm." There was the afternoon Greta mentioned almost casually that it was her birthday. She hadn't expected anyone to remember or care. But that evening, the camp cook, a British woman named Mrs. Davies, who'd lost 2 sons in the war, appeared with a small cake. Not much, just flour and sugar and a scraping of jam, but she'd used her own rations to make it. 20 years old deserves a cake," she said gruffly. Greta sobbed so hard she couldn't eat it for 10 minutes. There was the guard, the young one who'd avoided their eyes that first morning, who started teaching them English phrases during the evening recreation hour. "Not officially," he said. "Just might be useful." Yeah. His name was Thomas. He was 22. He'd landed at Normandy and fought through France. He'd seen things he didn't talk about, but he spoke to them like people, not prisoners. And sometimes he'd show them photographs of his family farm in Dorset. "This is my mom," he'd say, pointing. "And that's our dog, Bertie. Useless for herring, but a good lad." Margaret, who'd spent months learning to see German soldiers as boys first and enemies second, found herself doing the same with Thomas. He was just a boy in uniform, like all the others, like the ones she tried to save in the field hospital. The cognitive dissonance was exhausting. They'd been taught, indoctrinated, really, that the British were barbaric, that they'd shown no mercy to German civilians, that captured German women could expect only brutality. The propaganda had been specific, detailed, designed to terrify. And yet here they were, fed, clothed, allowed to write letters home, censored, but allowed, even permitted to organize their own recreation schedule. One evening in late October, someone suggested they sing. Felt dangerous at first. German songs, German voices raised together. Would the guards burst in, accuse them of sedition? But they sang anyway, quietly at first, then with growing confidence. Gut guttet. The Brahms lullaby every German child knew. Halfway through, Margaret noticed Thomas standing in the doorway listening. She tensed, waiting for him to tell them to stop. Instead, he smiled sadly. "My grand used to sing that," he said. "Different words, but same tune. Funny that." Later, one of the women, a former teacher named Anna, broke down. "How do we reconcile this?" she asked. "Everything we were told, everything we believed, how do we square it with this?" She gestured around the barracks at the warm stove, the clean bunks, the small comforts they'd been granted. "Maybe we don't," Liesl said quietly. "Maybe we just accept that we were lied to." But accepting that meant accepting everything else. That the war they'd supported might have been unjust. That the ideology they'd been raised in might have been poison. That the future they'd imagined, a 1,000-year Reich, prosperity, pride, had been a fairy tale told to children. It was easier to believe the British were lying now, playing a long game, softening them up for some future cruelty. But weeks passed, then months, and the cruelty never came. November 8, 1945. I received a letter from home today, or what used to be home. My mother is alive, living in the ruins of our apartment building in Hamburg. She has no heat, little food, and her words are desperate. She asked if the British are treating me well. I didn't know how to answer her. How do I tell her that I eat 3 meals a day while she starves? That I have a warm bed while she sleeps under rubble? That the enemy has shown me more mercy than I ever expected? While Germany, our Germany, has become a graveyard. I feel guilty for every bite of bread, but I eat it anyway. What else can I do? From Liesl Hartmann's diary, recovered in 1982. The winter brought its own revelations. The British rationing system, they learned, was strict but fair. Everyone had a ration book from the king to the lowest laborer, and everyone made do with the same allowances. The guards ate the same food they did. Mrs. Davies, the cook, mentioned one day that she'd given up her sugar ration for the month to make that birthday cake for Greta. "You didn't have to do that," Greta said, stricken. "No," Mrs. Davies agreed. "But someone did it for my boys when they were stationed abroad. Seemed right to pass it on." In December, the camp administration organized a Christmas celebration. Nothing elaborate. Some evergreen branches, a few handmade decorations, carols sung in a mixture of German and English. The guards brought extra coal for the stoves. Someone produced a handful of chocolate bars, American from a care package, and distributed them among the prisoners. Margaret held hers for a long time before unwrapping it. She'd forgotten what chocolate tasted like. When she finally bit into it, the sweetness was so overwhelming. She had to sit down. "We were supposed to hate them," Anna said that night. "They made it so easy to hate them, and now they make it impossible," Liesl finished. The truth was settling in heavy and undeniable. They'd been wrong. Not just about the British, but about everything. The ideology that had promised them greatness had delivered only ruin. The propaganda that had warned them about enemy savagery had been projection, a description of what Germany had done, reflected back as accusation, and the men who told them these lies were either dead or in hiding, leaving them to pick through the rubble of their beliefs alone. Repatriation began in the early spring of 1946. They were processed in groups, given documents, a small amount of money, and transport back to Germany. Many of them didn't want to go. Britain, even in its rationed austerity, was safer than Germany, where starvation and chaos still reigned. But they had no choice. They were German nationals. They belonged in Germany whether they wanted to or not. Margareta returned to Hamburg to find her neighborhood unrecognizable. The hospital where she trained was a crater. Her family's apartment building was half collapsed. She moved in with her sister who'd survived by black market trading and didn't want to hear about Margareta's cozy imprisonment in England. Liesl went back to Schleswig-Holstein and found her parents' house occupied by refugees from the east. She didn't argue. Where else were they supposed to go? She found work as a translator for the British occupation authorities, the only job available to someone with her skills. Her former neighbors called her a collaborator. She ignored them. Greta, the youngest, struggled the most. She'd lost her entire family in the final days of the war. She had no home to return to, no one waiting for her. She drifted through the occupation zones, taking odd jobs, sleeping in refugee centers. For years, she told no one about her time in Britain. Felt too strange, too at odds with the suffering around her. But they wrote letters. Slowly, carefully, they found each other again. A network of women who'd shared the same transformative experience and couldn't quite explain it to anyone else. In 1953, Margaret organized the first reunion. 8 of them came, meeting in a cafe in Hanover. They talked late into the night, comparing memories, filling in gaps. "Do you ever think about Mrs. Davies?" Greta asked. "All the time," Margaret admitted. "I wrote to her once, sent it to the camp, hoping they'd forward it. Never heard back. I think about Thomas," Liesel said. "Wonder if he made it home to his farm." They'd all carried pieces of that winter with them. Small kindnesses that had cracked their certainty, moments of humanity that had forced them to rebuild their understanding of the world. Some had embraced it, using their experience as a foundation for new beliefs. Others had buried it, finding it too painful to reconcile with their loyalty to Germany. But none of them had forgotten. In 1967, a British journalist researching P camps stumbled across their story. He tracked down several of the women and interviewed them. The article he published, "The Prisoners Who Came Home Changed," caused a minor scandal in Germany. Critics accused the women of exaggerating British kindness to flatter their former captives. Defenders argued that their testimony was valuable precisely because it was unexpected. Liesel, by then a grandmother living in Kiel, wrote a letter to the editor. It was published in full. "I don't expect anyone to believe that our imprisonment was pleasant. It wasn't. We were frightened, displaced, uncertain of our futures. But the British did not abuse us. They did not torture us. They did not violate us. They treated us as human beings even though we were the enemy. This shocked us because we'd been taught they would do the opposite." That shock, that moment when expectation collided with reality, changed us. It forced us to question everything we'd been told, everything we'd believed. For some of us, that questioning led to new understanding. For others, it led to despair. But I think it was necessary. Germany had to confront its lies, and we had to confront ours. The British didn't set out to teach us anything. They just behaved with basic decency. That it seemed revolutionary to us tells you everything you need to know about what we'd become. The knock came at dawn. They'd braced themselves for cruelty and received bread instead. That single moment, that reversal rippled outward through decades, shaping how 23 women understood the war, their country, and themselves. This is one of thousands of untold stories from World War II. Stories that challenge what we think we know about heroes and enemies, about propaganda and truth. Subscribe to make sure you never miss these hidden chapters of history. And share this video with anyone who believes the past is simpler than it actually was. History remembers the big battles, the famous leaders, the turning points that shifted the course of nations. But history is also made in smaller moments. A guard who brings bread instead of violence. A cook who surrenders her sugar ration. A young soldier who shares photographs of his dog. These moments don't win wars, but they win something else. The slow, difficult work of rebuilding common humanity from the ruins of ideology. The women who'd screamed at that knock in September 1945 spent the rest of their lives processing what came after. Some became advocates for reconciliation. Others retreated into silence. A few never stopped grieving for the Germany they'd believed in, even as they acknowledged the Germany that had actually existed. But all of them carried the memory of that morning. The moment when fear met kindness, when expectation shattered against reality, when the knock on the door brought not violation but breakfast. And in that moment, small, unremarkable, buried in the footnotes of history, everything changed. What happened in that barracks near Nottingham wasn't unique. Similar scenes played out in P camps across the Allied territories, wherever captured enemies were treated according to the Geneva Conventions rather than vengeance. But each instance mattered. Each reversal of expectation planted a seed. Some of those seeds grew into broader understanding, others withered, but they were planted nonetheless. Germany spent decades after the war grappling with its past, confronting the lies it had told itself, excavating the truth from beneath layers of propaganda. That reckoning didn't start in courtrooms or parliaments. It started in moments like these, in the cognitive dissonance of prisoners who'd expected brutality and received bread, in the slow collapse of certainty, in the painful reconstruction of morality from first principles. The British guards who knocked on that door probably never thought about it again. It was routine for them. Just another morning, another group of prisoners, another meal delivered. But for the 23 women inside, it was the beginning of everything. The beginning of doubt, of understanding, of the long journey back to a humanity they'd been taught to abandon. 79 years later, most of those women are gone. Margaret died in 1998, Liesl in 2003, Greta in 2011. Their children and grandchildren carry fragments of their stories, sometimes unsure what to do with them. How do you inherit the memory of a moment that undid everything your grandmother believed? But the story persists because it has to, because the knock on the door keeps coming in different forms, in different conflicts, wherever ideology tries to paint the enemy as inhuman. And the answer to that knock, whether it brings violence or breakfast, vengeance or mercy, still shapes the world we wake up to. They'd shouted, "We won't take our clothes off," braced for violation, certain of cruelty, prepared to resist the only way they knew how. Instead, they got bread and that changed.